Welcome to the channel. Here, we dive deep into powerful books and break down their ideas in a calm, thoughtful way. In today's episode, we explore the anatomy of fanaticism, a deep look into the psychology of extreme beliefs, what drives them, and how they shape individuals and groups. If you enjoy clear, thought-provoking breakdowns like this, make sure to subscribe and stay with us for more.
So back in the 1930s, there was this Japanese delegation that traveled to Berlin.
Right.
And their mission was essentially to study the Nazi movement, which was, just rapidly consuming the German populace at the time.
Yeah, they were looking for a blueprint, basically.
Exactly. So they observed the rallies, the architecture, just the absolute fanaticism of the crowds. And they were completely in awe of this incredible unifying power.
But the visit didn't end the way you'd expect.
No, it didn't at all. When it concluded, the Japanese delegates actually left rather disappointed. They reportedly told their hosts, we wish we could have something like this in Japan, but we can't because we haven't got any Jews.
It is just a chilling historical anecdote.
It really is.
And it exposes this terrifying psychological formula. To build a mass movement, you don't necessarily need a perfect ideology. And you definitely don't need a utopian vision that actually makes, logical sense.
Right.
What you need, fundamentally, is a perfectly manufactured devil.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because that anecdote completely shatters how we normally think about history and political revolution.
Oh, absolutely.
We tend to view mass movements, whether they are political, religious, nationalist, whatever, as these grand clashes of high-minded philosophies. But today, we are stripping away the philosophy.
We are doing a sweeping psychological autopsy of fanaticism itself.
Yes, a deep dive into the factual and analytical content of Eric Hoffer's seminal 1951 text, The True Believer. Thoughts on the nature of mass movements.
What's fascinating here is Hoffer's deeply taxonomical approach. I mean, he doesn't evaluate movements based on their moral standing or their stated goals.
Right. He doesn't care about that.
No, it doesn't matter to him if the movement is left-wing, right-wing, a religious crusade, or a nationalist uprising. He looks at them the way a botanist looks at a field of flora, just categorizing the underlying human machinery.
And I think it's crucial to note for you listening that our goal today is to analyze the mechanics of history impartially.
Exactly. We need to be very clear on this.
Yeah, we are not endorsing any of the ideologies we discussed today, nor are we taking sides on any of these historical conflicts.
Right. We are simply trying to convey the ideas contained in Hoffer's original analysis of how human beings operate when they, merge into a collective mass.
The mission of this deep dive is to figure out the chillingly mechanical processes by which individuals willingly, even eagerly, surrender their autonomy.
Why do people want to burn down the world?
Right. What is the psychology of the convert? What are the dark tools used to forge this terrifying unity? And what is the life cycle of these historical tidal waves?
Let's start with the spark, because every movement begins with a profound hunger for change.
And we usually frame the desire for progress as a rational, positive trait. You look at a problem in society and you want to fix it.
Right. That's the healthy version.
But Hoffer draws this massive, heavy line between people who want to incrementally repair the world and those who want to see it reduced to ash.
And that distinction really hinges on the psychological condition of the individual who is looking at the world. Hoffer argues that a desire for radical change requires two specific volatile ingredients.
Okay, what are they?
Well, you need discontent, obviously, but you also need a sense of power and an extravagant hope for the future.
Extravagant hope. I like that phrasing.
Yeah. Let's look at the successful and the privileged, for example. By and large, they actually fear radical change.
Of course they do. They're winning.
Right. They view the world as this highly precarious, delicate mechanism. Even if they worked incredibly hard for their wealth or status, deep down, there's this underlying anxiety that their success feels partly like a lucky alignment of circumstance.
Yeah, if you're currently benefiting from the system, you view society as a fragile ecosystem.
Yeah.
You don't want to introduce an invasive species. You definitely don't want sudden shifts. But the profoundly frustrated view that exact same ecosystem entirely differently.
They don't see a delicate balance at all.
No, they see a rigged, malicious structure. They blame their personal failures, their miseries, their lack of status entirely on the world around them.
Because to the frustrated individual, the present is irreparably spoiled.
And incremental change is actually insulting to them because it validates the structure that they believe ruined their lives. They
Yeah.
favor radical destruction to clear the board entirely.
And this is where mass movements step in, acting as these massive generating plants of general enthusiasm.
Right.
They provide that extravagant hope we talked about. Like the French revolutionaries relied on the omnipotence of human reason to justify their terror.
While the Bolsheviks relied on the inevitable scientific march of Marxist doctrine.
And the Nazis relied on the intoxicating, immediate power of blitzkrieg and racial propaganda.
In every single case, the movement provides an illusion of immense power to people who, individually, feel utterly powerless.
But this brings us to a complex, almost paradoxical point about where this intense frustration actually originates. It brings us to what Hoffer calls the burden of freedom.
Oh man, I found this part of the text profoundly challenging.
It is. It completely subverts the Enlightenment narrative we all grew up with.
Yeah, because we inherently equate freedom with happiness and stability. But Hoffer suggests the exact opposite.
He does. He argues that freedom actually aggravates frustration. Let's consider a highly structured, rigid society, like a society of feudal serfs or the abjectly poor living under an absolute monarchy.
Okay.
If you fail in that society, or if you are miserable, your misery is universal and unquestionable. You are a serf. Your father was a serf.
You're too busy surviving the winter to suffer from individual existential frustration.
Exactly. The structure protects your ego. But in a free society, if you fail, the blame falls squarely on your own shoulders.
You had the freedom to succeed and you didn't.
Right. Freedom multiplies the opportunities for failure, and more importantly, it internalizes the blame for that failure.
I want to visualize this for you, the listener, because the mechanics of this frustration are so crucial to everything that follows. Imagine you are tinkering with a highly complex, fragile machine that spits out a $100 bill every hour.
Okay, I like this.
So you are the successful person. You are going to oil the gears carefully. You'll read the manual. You will protect that machine with your life.
Because it's working for you.
Exactly. Now imagine you are standing on the other side of a glass wall. You are watching other people get the money. You are completely free to walk away, to try building your own machine, or to ask for a job maintaining it.
But you feel like a profound failure.
Yes. Every $100 bill dispensed to someone else feels like a personal indictment of your worth. You don't want to recalibrate the machine.
Because recalibrating it means acknowledging it works.
Right. You want a sledgehammer, you want to smash the machine to pieces so nobody gets the money, and then you want to build something entirely new from the rubble, where you are the one in charge.
That is the exact psychological state of the frustrated individual. And historically, we see the stark difference between leaders who understand this need for the sledgehammer and those who don't.
Like Peter the Great, right.
Yes. Consider Peter the Great's attempts to westernize and modernize Russia in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. He possessed absolute autocratic power. He was a ruthless visionary.
He modernized the military, changed the administrative structure. I mean, he even forced his courtiers to shave their beards to look more European.
He tried everything. But he failed to fundamentally transform the soul of the Russian masses. The modernization was largely superficial.
Why is that?
Hoffer's explanation is that Peter the Great tried to change the machine rationally. He didn't infuse the Russian masses with a holy cause. He didn't offer them an extravagant hope or a unified fanatical vision.
Contrast that with the Bolsheviks centuries later.
Exactly. The Bolsheviks succeeded in rapidly modernizing a vast, backward agrarian society into an industrial superpower in a matter of decades.
How? Because they tapped into mass enthusiasm.
They didn't just issue administrative orders. They turned modernization into a holy crusade. They gave the frustrated masses the sledgehammer of radical destruction.
They allowed them to smash the old czarist order and replaced it with a fanatical, collective vision of the future.
So we have this reservoir of frustrated individuals holding sledgehammers, desperate to smash the machine.
Which leads to a terrifying realization about the nature of ideology. If I am sitting there burning with resentment and eager to lose my identity in a collective cause, what determines whether I join a radical left-wing commune, an extreme right-wing militia, or a fanatical religious sect?
The text provides a truly startling answer to that. It fundamentally doesn't matter.
Wait, really? It doesn't matter?
It is perhaps Hoffer's most controversial and brilliant observation. Mass movements are highly competitive. They vie for the exact same demographic.
Oh, wow.
They view each other's followers not as unreachable enemies, but as their own potential converts. because at their psychological core, mass movements are interchangeable.
That is why.
A religious movement can seamlessly evolve into a nationalist one, or a social revolution can take on the rigid dogma of a religion. Hoffer describes this as a family likeness.
Right. They all demand blind faith, they all breed fanaticism, and they all appeal to the exact same psychological profile.
I love the botanical analogy Hoffer uses here because it strips away all the political noise. Think of the tomato and the deadly nightshade.
Okay.
They belong to the exact same plant family, the Solanaceae family. One is nutritious, you slice it up for a salad.
And the other is highly toxic and will shut down your nervous system.
Exactly. But if you look at them morphologically under a microscope, their physiological traits, their cellular structure, the way they flower, it's identical.
Mass movements operate on the exact same principle. The end result might be a beneficial social reform that expands human rights, or it might be a horrific totalitarian regime that murders millions.
But the human psychological machinery fueling both the tomato and the nightshade is identical.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it forces us to reevaluate why people join movements at all. We tend to think people join political parties or movements because they carefully weigh the intellectual doctrine and agree with the policies.
But Hoffer argues that the appeal of a mass movement is not its specific doctrine. The doctrine is largely irrelevant.
So what's the appeal?
The appeal is the refuge the movement offers from an unwanted self. A practical organization, like a corporation, a trade union, or a standard political party, appeals to self-advancement.
It says, join us and you will get richer, your working conditions will improve, your taxes will go down.
Exactly. But a mass movement appeals to something much darker and deeper. It satisfies the passion for self-renunciation.
It's the desire to cease existing as an individual. You hate yourself, you hate your life, so you want to be absorbed into a giant organism where your personal failures no longer matter.
And the historical evidence for this interchangeability is just staggering. Take Dr. Chaim Weissman, the prominent Zionist leader and later the first president of Israel.
What did he say?
He recounted a profound observation made by his own mother. She had two deeply fanatical sons. One was a radical communist revolutionary active in Russia, and the other, Weissman, was a dedicated Zionist working toward a Jewish state.
Oh, wow. In the same family.
Yes. And his mother noted, quite astutely, that if her revolutionary son is right, they will all be happy in Russia. But if her Zionist son is right, they will all be happy in Palestine.
That is incredible. The mother recognized the morphological similarity. The family produced two true believers. Their psychological engines were identical. They merely hitched those engines to different ideological trains.
And we also see this understood at the highest levels of totalitarian leadership. Hitler explicitly stated that a radical German communist could easily be converted into a devoted Nazi.
Because he recognized the fanatical raw material was already present.
Right. But Hitler believed a moderate, mild-mannered social democrat could never become a true Nazi.
Because the moderate is still attached to their own self-interest. The moderate still wants to tinker with the machine and get their $100 bill.
Exactly. They haven't reached that critical threshold of frustration where they want to surrender their identity.
The fanatic, whether communist or fascist, has already detached from their self. They are just a free-floating human atom looking for the strongest collective body to dissolve into.
Which naturally leads us to examine the demographics of desperation. If the specific doctrine is secondary to the psychological need, who exactly are these people?
Who makes up this roster of the frustrated?
Hoffer provides a meticulous catalog of potential converts, and it defies a lot of our conventional modern stereotypes about who becomes a revolutionary.
The first group he identifies is the new poor. And the distinction here is critical. He's not talking about people who have lived in poverty for generations.
Right, that's a huge difference.
He's talking about people whose poverty is recent. Think of the dispossessed landlords during the Puritan Revolution in England, or the ruined middle class in Germany right before the rise of the Nazis.
People whose savings were wiped out by hyperinflation overnight.
Exactly. The psychological engine driving the new poor is memory. They possess a vivid, agonizing memory of better things.
That memory acts as an accelerant. They aren't resigned to their fate because they know what it feels like to have status and security.
Contrast them with the abjectly poor, those who have starved for generations, whose parents and grandparents were destitute.
The abjectly poor are entirely consumed by the mechanics of survival. When you are starving, your entire horizon narrows to finding your next meal.
You don't have the luxury of dreaming about utopias or thousand-year empires. You just want bread.
This maps perfectly onto modern economic anxieties, actually. The most volatile element in society isn't the demographic that has always been impoverished. It's the demographic that was promised a comfortable middle-class life, achieved it briefly, and then had it ripped away.
That makes total sense. Then we have a truly fascinating category, the creative poor or the misfits.
Oh, this one is interesting.
It's not about money. This is about the slipping author, the aging artist whose creative flow has dried up, the scientist who can no longer produce original work.
Because the psychology of the blocked creative is deeply tied to the concept of immortality.
How so?
An artist justifies their existence and silences their existential dread by generating unique individual value. If I write a masterpiece, a piece of me lives forever, my ego is secured.
Right.
But when that creative outlet dries up, the individual is left staring into the void of their own mediocrity and mortality. They become violently frustrated.
Because they can no longer generate value as an individual, they seek salvation by merging into a collective.
Exactly. They trade the immortality of the masterpiece for the immortality of the mass movement.
They can't build their own monument, so they join a million other people to build a pyramid.
That's a great way to put it.
And we cannot overlook the bored. Hoffer positions unrelieved boredom as a massive flashing red indicator of a society's ripeness for a mass movement.
We tend to dismiss boredom as a trivial emotion, just a temporary lack of stimulation.
But Hoffer defines it as a painful, creeping awareness of a barren, meaningless life.
And people will go to astonishing, sometimes horrific lengths to give their lives the illusion of meaning and drama. When daily life becomes a predictable, sterile routine devoid of risk or high purpose, the mind begins to crave the theatricality of a movement.
And finally, Hoffer catalogs the sinners. Fervent patriotism or religious fanaticism often acts as a sanctuary from a guilty conscience.
If you are carrying a heavy burden of personal guilt, you are desperate to lose your stained, guilty individual self. You merge into the pure, righteous collective.
The movement absolves you because your past individual actions no longer matter. You are now merely an instrument of the holy cause.
All of these categories, the new poor, the blocked artist, the bored, the guilty, they all illustrate a broader historical paradox, famously articulated by the French historian Alexis de Tocqueville.
Oh, de Tocqueville.
Yeah. He studied the French Revolution extensively, and he noticed a very counterintuitive pattern. Popular discontent and revolutionary fervor are actually highest, not when conditions are at their absolute worst, but when misery is bearable and when conditions are actually improving.
This is a massive aha moment that reframes how we look at social unrest. We naturally assume that the most oppressed, destitute people are the ones most likely to revolt.
But de Tocqueville and Hoffer argue the exact opposite.
Let's think about this visually for a second. Imagine you have lived your entire life in a pitch-black cave. You don't know what light is. You have no concept of the sun.
Yep.
You accept the dark because it is the only reality you have ever known. Now imagine someone walks into that cave, turns on a blindingly bright flashlight for 5 minutes, lets you see the texture of the walls and the expanse of the cavern, and then turns the flashlight off.
You will fight to the death to get that light back.
Exactly. The taste of better things excites revolt. Absolute, unchanging misery just breeds paralysis.
The historical record bears this out repeatedly. Just prior to the French Revolution, the French peasants actually owned roughly a third of the agricultural land.
Wow.
Yeah. They were not entirely landless, destitute serfs. The same was true for the Russian peasants in the years leading up to the Bolshevik Revolution. They had tasted ownership, they had experienced a slight alleviation of their historical misery, and that taste ignited a burning desire for total transformation.
Furthermore, if you look at who actually funds and agitates in the early stages of these movements, you frequently find the bored and the wealthy.
Right. Before the French Revolution, it was the bored wives of wealthy businessmen and the idle aristocracy who were restless, hosting salons and applauding radical innovators who wanted to tear down the state.
And in the 1920s and 30s, affluent society ladies in Germany helped fund Hitler's early rise. Misery does not generate a mass movement. Frustration, boredom, and the agony of thwarted expectations generate a mass movement.
So we have assembled our roster. We understand the deep psychological need of the frustrated convert to lose themselves. But this brings us to the most mechanical and perhaps the darkest aspect of Hoffer's analysis.
How does a movement take a self-obsessed, highly frustrated individual and convince them to literally, physically die for the cause?
Yes, how do you build a factory of self-sacrifice? Because survival is our most fundamental biological imperative.
Overcoming that requires a terrifyingly effective psychological operation.
The technique involves a systemic, methodical separation of the individual from their flesh and blood reality. If you want someone to willingly march to their death, you have to convince them that they aren't actually dying.
Okay, so how do they do that?
The first vital step in this process is identification. The individual must be hammered, folded, and molded into a human atom. You are stripped of your personal history, your family ties, your individual aspirations.
You become solely a thread in the vast tunic of the movement.
The psychological trick here is profound. If you are entirely absorbed into a collective organism, you cannot truly die as long as the organism lives on.
Oh, wow. Your biological death is irrelevant because your identity has been successfully outsourced to the eternal collective.
And to reinforce this outsourced identity, movements rely heavily on make-believe. Dying has to be framed as a grand theatrical gesture.
This is exactly why mass movements are obsessed with pageantry. The endless parades, the matching uniforms, the colossal architecture, the choreographed salutes.
It's not just aesthetic, it's a psychological necessity.
You are playing a role on a magnificent world stage. The pageantry masks the grim, dirty, biological reality of death. The movement convinces you that you aren't bleeding out in the mud of a trench. You are exiting stage left in a glorious historical opera.
Precisely. The individual is enveloped in a fabricated mythological reality. But the final, and perhaps most crucial step in manufacturing self-sacrifice is the deprecation of the present.
Deprecation of the present.
The movement must aggressively paint the present day, the current society, the current norms, the individual's current life as vile, meaningless, corrupt, and utterly beyond saving. Hoffer calls the present a mere doormat to the glorious millennium.
The logic is devastatingly simple. You are being asked to sacrifice your present life. If you value your life, you won't do it.
Right.
So the movement does the work of convincing you that your present life is completely worthless anyway. You aren't giving up anything of value. You are trading dirt for eternity.
And this leads to the fascinating concept of fighting for things which are not. People will rarely fight to the absolute death for things they already possess and enjoy.
If you have a comfortable home, a secure job, and a happy family, you are naturally conservative in your actions. You want to preserve what you have. You avoid fatal risks.
But the frustrated individual fights for, as Hoffer puts it, cities yet to be built and gardens yet to be planted. They are fighting for a utopian future that does not exist.
And because it does not exist, it is utterly perfect. It has no practical flaws, no bureaucratic inefficiencies, no compromises.
Here's where it gets really interesting. To protect that perfect, non-existent future, the doctrine of the movement serves as a fact-proof screen.
I absolutely love this phrase, a fact-proof screen.
The doctrine isn't meant to be debated or analyzed. If you fully, rationally analyze the doctrine, if you apply empirical evidence to it, it loses its magic. The flaws become apparent.
It must be believed blindly. The less a person has to live for in the real, tangible world, the more violently and recklessly they will fight for an imaginary one.
We see this desperation beautifully, if tragically, illustrated in literature. In Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, the character Raskolnikov, who is isolated, guilty, and profoundly alienated from society, muses on the nature of existence.
What does he say?
He imagines that if he had to live on a tiny, precarious ledge over a terrifying abyss, standing in pitch darkness for all eternity, he would still prefer that over dying.
Oh man, it perfectly captures the isolated individual's sheer, naked terror of death when they have nothing larger than themselves to connect to. When you are just a fragile ego, death is the ultimate, unacceptable annihilation.
Contrast Raskolnikov's terror with the behavior of the British public during the London Blitz in World War II. Winston Churchill understood the mechanics of mass psychology brilliantly.
He didn't just ask Londoners to survive the bombings. He didn't appeal to their basic survival instincts.
No, he cast them as the lead actors in a grandiose world historical opera. He told them that if the British Empire lasted for 1,000 years, men would still say this was their finest hour.
He gave them an eternal audience. He merged their individual suffering into an immortal collective narrative.
And it worked. The psychological resilience of the British public during the Blitz was astonishing. They endured horrific conditions because they were living in a mythological present.
Or look back to the early Christian theologian Tertullian. When discussing the resurrection of Christ, he famously stated, "It is certain because it is impossible."
That is the ultimate rejection of the rational empirical world. You embrace the impossible precisely because the possible rational world has failed to provide you with meaning.
So, we have established how the movement promises a glorious future, how it deprecates the present, and how it demands self-sacrifice. But a mass movement is a daily, grinding reality.
Right, it's not just a one-time event.
What are the day-to-day mechanisms that maintain this unnatural state? What melts these desperate, disparate individuals into a single, terrifying block of granite?
We have to talk about the unifying slime.
Ugh. The unifying slime. It's an incredibly evocative, ugly phrase, but it perfectly describes the binding agents holding the bricks of the movement together.
And the most accessible, the most comprehensive, the most potent unifying agent of all? Hatred.
Hatred is incredibly efficient from a psychological standpoint. It pulls people entirely out of their own personal problems.
If your mind is entirely consumed with a visceral, burning hatred for an external enemy, you do not have the cognitive bandwidth to dwell on your own failures, your boredom, or your poverty.
Hoffer meticulously outlines the anatomy of the perfect enemy, the ideal devil required to unite a mass movement.
Right, the devil must be omnipresent. They can't just be a threat over the border. They have to be hiding in the shadows of your own society.
They must be omnipotent, capable of causing all the world's complicated systemic problems. Economy crashed. The devil did it. Crop failed. The devil did it.
And crucially, they should be foreign, or easily cast as foreign and alien to the pure collective.
This is where we must explore a deeply counterintuitive and uncomfortable truth about human psychology. We generally assume that intense hatred springs from being wronged.
Like, I hate you because you hurt me.
Right. But Hopper points out that the most virulent, unyielding hatred often springs from having wronged someone else.
Wait, stop there, because that feels completely backward to how we understand grievance. Walk us through the mechanics of that. Why do I hate someone I just wronged?
It comes back to the ego and the guilty conscience. Imagine you commit a terrible injustice against a neighbor, you steal from them, or you ruin their reputation. You are now burdened with an intense, agonizing guilt.
Okay, yeah.
To live with yourself, to silence that guilty conscience, you must convince yourself that the person you harmed actually deserved it. You cannot be the villain in your own story.
Oh, wow. So you invent a reason why they are bad.
Therefore, you must construct a narrative where your victim is depraved, evil, and worthy of extermination. The more you wrong them, the more monstrous you must make them in your mind to justify your actions.
Multiply that individual psychological defense mechanism by millions of people, and you have the engine of a mass atrocity. The act of self-denial and joining a movement, the shedding of the individual self, gives the convert a feeling of supreme, unassailable righteousness.
And that righteousness acts as a blank check, a moral license to commit terrible acts against the designated devil. De-individualization is fundamentally a process of dehumanization.
As Hoffer asserts, the torture chamber is a corporate institution.
That line gives me chills.
When you surrender your personal responsibility to a collective, committing atrocities no longer registers as a personal sin. It feels like a bureaucratic duty. You are simply following orders, managing the paperwork of the holy cause. The personal conscience is anesthetized.
Alongside hatred, we have the binding agent of suspicion. This blew my mind because it seems counterproductive. You'd think a unified brotherhood would be built on deep trust.
But Hoffer argues that the frustrated project their own self-contempt onto everyone else within the group. Mutual suspicion acts as an iron band holding the group together.
If everyone is constantly watching everyone else for the slightest deviation from the doctrine, for the slightest sign of disloyalty, nobody dares step out of line.
The fear of being targeted by the very collective you surrendered to keeps everyone fiercely, performatively loyal. It creates an atmosphere where fanaticism is constantly escalating because everyone is trying to prove they are the most devoted.
And this brings us to the interplay of coercion and persuasion. We have a tendency to view propaganda as a magical, hypnotic tool that can brainwash anyone.
But Hoffer is very clear on this. Propaganda only takes root in minds that are already plowed and ready for the seeds. It only works on the frustrated.
To maintain a movement long-term across an entire population, persuasion is entirely insufficient. A sharp sword must stand behind the propaganda.
Coercion is vital.
Yeah.
And the psychological effect of coercion on the human mind is chilling. You would logically think that if someone is forced at gunpoint or under threat of prison to join a movement, they would harbor a secret, burning resentment toward that movement.
Right. If you force me to wear the uniform, I'll wear it, but I'll be plotting your downfall in my head.
But human psychology rarely works that cleanly. Admitting to yourself that you surrendered your autonomy out of pure, naked cowardice is devastating to the ego. It is a psychological wound most people cannot bear.
So what do they do?
To rationalize their own cowardice, the coerced convert undergoes a profound internal alchemy. They convince themselves that they didn't submit out of fear. They submitted because they actually believe in the cause.
Oh, that is incredibly dark.
Their sudden, intense fanaticism is a desperate defense mechanism to hide their own weakness from themselves. The coerced often become the most vicious enforcers of the doctrine.
And looking at the historical record, the necessity of these dark binding agents is undeniable. Stalin's great purges in the 1930s are a perfect example of suspicion and coercion working together.
Absolutely.
Stalin forced old, highly dedicated Bolsheviks, the very men who led the revolution, to publicly confess to absurd, obviously fabricated treasonous crimes.
And we must ask why they confessed. These were hardened revolutionaries who had survived Tsar's prisons and Siberian exile without breaking. Why did they confess to Stalin's show trials?
Because they had been entirely stripped of their individual identities decades prior.
Their only existence, their only meaning, was within the framework of the party. To be excommunicated from the party, to die as an enemy of the collective, was a fate worse than physical death.
They confessed to horrific lies simply to regain a twisted sort of communion with the party right before the executioner's bullet. The corporate institution of the movement was their entire universe.
So we have explored the psychological mechanics of the convert and the unifying slime that binds them. Now we need to zoom out and look at the timeline.
Because every mass movement has a distinct life cycle. It is not a static phenomenon. It is a dramatic arc.
Who creates the conditions for the movement? Who actually ignites it? And who ultimately reins it in?
Hoffer structures this life cycle as a play with a very specific cast of characters. Act 1 is entirely driven by the men of words.
These are the intellectual precursors. They're the writers, the priests, the philosophers, the professors, the journalists.
Their primary, almost obsessive function is to poke holes in the prevailing order. They dismantle the status quo through critique, satire, and philosophical deconstruction.
But Hoffer points out something rather cynical about their motivations. We often view these historical intellectuals as pure-hearted champions of the oppressed. But Hoffer suggests they are frequently driven by vanity.
Vanity? Really?
Yeah, they feel unappreciated by the current power structure. They believe they should be the ones guiding society, and they are bitter that they aren't.
Their tragedy is one of unintended consequences. The men of words almost universally desire individual freedom. They want the freedom to write, to speak, to debate in salons and cafes.
But by ruthlessly mocking the established institutions, by eroding the traditional respect for the church, the crown, or the government, they unwittingly create a massive vacuum.
They destroy the old certainties, and in doing so, they create a terrifying hunger for blind faith among the masses.
They break the old machine, but they don't have the stomach to build a new one. And into that howling void steps the protagonist of Act 2, the fanatic.
The fanatics are a completely different breed. They are often non-creative men of words, the failed artists, the blocked writers, the frustrated misfits we discussed earlier. When the chaos erupts, they step into the center.
Unlike the men of words, the fanatics despise the present entirely. They have no interest in reform, debate, or intellectual freedom. They want to annihilate the rubble of the old world.
They possess the singular, ruthless vision required to actually hatch the mass movement. They harness the hatred and the desire for self-sacrifice.
But their fatal flaw is that their native element is chaos. A fanatic cannot settle down. They cannot run a functioning bureaucracy. If left in charge, they will keep pushing the movement toward increasingly suicidal reckonings.
If the fanatic stays in power too long, the movement burns out in a blaze of glory, or it completely destroys the host nation. To survive, the movement must transition to Act 3, which brings in the practical men of action.
The men of action are the administrators, the generals, the ruthless bureaucrats. They step in, often violently, to save the movement from the suicidal recklessness of the fanatics.
They take this wild, chaotic energy and institutionalize it. They freeze the movement in place, establishing laws, hierarchies, and orthodoxies. They turn the revolutionary fire into a permanent, heavily policed state religion.
This raises an important question. What happens to the men of words who started the whole thing?
Right, you have these intellectuals who just wanted to write edgy essays about freedom. Suddenly, the fanatics take over, the masses are marching in lockstep, demanding absolute uniformity in the execution of anyone who thinks differently.
The men of words are horrified. They create a monster that now demands their total submission. Almost universally, the intellectuals who paved the way for a movement are swept away, exiled, or executed by the very fanatics they unleashed.
You know, it's like building a city. The men of words are the building inspectors. They walk around with their clipboards, pointing out the rot in the foundations, condemning the old structures, declaring them unfit for human habitation.
They aren't builders.
Exactly. Then the fanatics arrive. They are the demolition crew. They show up with the dynamite and they revel in the destruction. They love the explosions so much they want to keep blowing things up just for the thrill of the blast.
Right, if you leave the demolition crew in charge, you just end up with a smoking crater.
Yeah.
Then the men of action arrive. They are the brutal new contractors.
They violently wrestle the detonators away from the fanatics, line everyone up, and force them to start laying bricks, whether they want to or not. They build the new oppressive structure.
And history provides endless iterations of this three-act play. Look at the ancient world. The Greek philosophers and early Christian apologists, the men of words, spent centuries relentlessly debunking and mocking the old pagan cults. They paved the way.
Then came the early Christian fanatics who eagerly embraced martyrdom and aggressively tore down the pagan temples.
Eventually you get to Constantine, the ultimate man of action, who institutionalized Christianity into the rigid administrative framework of the Roman Empire.
The French Revolution is another textbook example. The brilliant intellectuals of the Enlightenment, Voltaire, Rousseau, they championed reason and tolerance, dismantling the divine right of kings.
They paved the way for the Jacobins, the bloody fanatics like Robespierre who instituted the Reign of Terror.
And who ended it? Napoleon, the ultimate man of action, who harnessed the revolutionary energy and turned it into an imperial military machine.
And in the 20th century, the pattern repeats with horrifying scale. Look at the Nazi leadership. Hitler, Goebbels, Rosenberg, they all began as deeply frustrated, failed artists and writers.
They were classic fanatics who turned to destruction when they couldn't create.
In the Soviet Union, you had intellectuals like Trotsky, who were eventually outmaneuvered and murdered by Stalin. Stalin was the quintessential man of action.
He wasn't a soaring visionary. He was a ruthless, paranoid administrator who purged the fanatics and blended the radical Bolshevik ideology with the heavy, brutal bureaucracy of the old Tsarist regime.
This brings us to the final, crucial evaluation of Hoffer's framework. We've looked at the machinery, but how do we judge the legacy of these movements? Hoffer insists on being impartial, but he does distinguish between what he categorizes as good movements and bad movements based entirely on their outcomes.
And importantly, he addresses the creative void that exists during a movement's active phase.
Hoffer argues that the active, dynamic phase of any mass movement is entirely culturally sterile. It must be. A movement cannot tolerate art, literature, or science that exist for its own sake.
Everything must serve the holy cause.
The creative flow of an entire society, the intellectual energy of millions of people, is drained from individual pursuits and redirected entirely into the machinery of the movement. During the height of the active phase, a society produces propaganda, not art.
So how do we distinguish a good movement from a bad one? A good movement, in Hoffer's view, is one that has a very concrete, highly limited objective. For example, a rebellion to free a specific territory from a foreign tyrant.
It is a tangible goal. Once that goal is achieved, the movement loses its organizing principle and ends. The active phase terminates, and society returns to a state of normalcy.
But a bad movement is defined by a nebulous, physically impossible goal, a 1,000-year empire of racial purity, a perfectly equal heaven on earth where human greed is eradicated.
Because the goal fundamentally contradicts human nature and reality. It is impossible to achieve. Consequently, the active phase is interminable.
The state of emergency never ends. It just leads to endless militarization, endless internal purges to find the hidden devils, and endless misery, because the utopian horizon continuously recedes.
And what happens when a movement finally ends? This is where the story turns back toward light. Whenever we see a period of explosive cultural growth, a true creative renaissance, it almost always happens immediately after the active phase of a mass movement abruptly ends.
The collective discipline is suddenly relaxed, the iron band of suspicion is broken, and all that pent-up, highly disciplined energy is suddenly released back to the individual.
It is a massive societal exhale. Society's been holding its breath, muscles tensed, unified for action, but incapable of singing or speaking freely. When the crisis breaks, the cultural exhale produces masterpieces.
Consider the English poet John Milton. He spent 20 incredibly sterile years writing angry, propagandistic political pamphlets during the active phase of the Puritan Revolution. His immense creative genius was totally absorbed by the political cause.
It was only after the revolution failed, the monarchy was restored, and Milton was living in disgrace, completely alienated from political power, that the movement released him. And in that isolated individual state, he wrote Paradise Lost.
You can contrast the successful limited movements like the Dutch Rebellion against Spain, which quickly achieved its goal and led directly into the Dutch golden age of art, commerce, and science.
Right. Contrast that with the interminable active phases in Soviet Russia or Nazi Germany, where true culture was suffocated for decades beneath the weight of impossible goals.
So where does this leave us? We have taken a deeply analytical, entirely impartial journey through the anatomy of fanaticism. We have traced the path from the profound, agonizing frustration of the isolated individual through the manipulative factory of self-sacrifice, waded through the unifying slime of manufactured hatred, and watched the tragic transition from the intellectual men of words to the iron grip of the practical men of action.
It is a sobering, heavy framework, but understanding the machinery is the only way to recognize when it is being assembled around you. And I want to leave you, the listener, with something to mull over that builds directly on Hoffer's psychological observations.
Yeah, please, because Hoffer's text, written in 1951, feels terrifyingly prescient today.
It really does. Hoffer wrote this book in an era of print and radio. This was long before social media, before smartphones, before the modern, hyper-connected internet. Today, we live in an ecosystem governed by digital algorithms.
Algorithms of rage.
Exactly. And these algorithms are specifically designed to isolate us, to meticulously track and highlight our personal frustrations, and to feed us a custom-tailored, algorithmic, fact-proof screen of information.
They are literal generating plants of general enthusiasm and specific outrage.
Exactly. In a digital world where we are increasingly physically isolated from local, tangible communities, but constantly, incessantly exposed to virtual outrage and global crises, we have to ask a difficult question.
What's the question?
Are we uniquely primed for a new era of mass movements? Have Hoffer's men of words been replaced by algorithms of rage, constantly tearing down our institutions and stoking our discontent, just waiting for a new fanatic to step out of the digital chaos and offer us a holy cause?
That is a brilliant, unsettling question to end on. If the machinery of fanaticism is built into human psychology, then the digital age might just be the most efficient factory ever constructed. We want to thank you directly for joining us on this deep dive. Our goal was to unpack the mechanics of history and hopefully give you a new lens through which to view the world.
Keep questioning your own certainties.
Yes, remain fiercely mindful of that very thin, dangerous line between a healthy search for meaning and the dark surrender of the self. Because when you step into the world of fanatical devotion, the standard diagnostic tools fail. You have to learn how to see the machinery operating in the dark.